This is an entry into the Kahn Academy talent search, and it is designed to fit into the category given called advanced placement from high school and into college level. The category that it fits in is world history, and the subcategory is called religions, belief systems, philosophies, and ideologies. Now that's the topics from which I was able to choose. If I did not have a pre-established list of topics to choose from, I would say this lecture is an introduction to epistemology. Epistemology is how we know what we know. And it actually is a prolegomata. It is some knowledge that is needed before I can study any other area. I need to know, how do I know what I know? Because we all come into this stage of life of learning, of looking for knowledge, assuming that we know some things. More particularly, we assume that what we know is true. Well, actually, there are two things we assume before we get there. Number one, we assume that truth is, that there is something called truth that's out there for us to know. And number two, we often call that factual knowledge. We assume that there are facts for us to know. And the question of epistemology is, how do we know what we know? How do we learn knowledge? How do we learn about the reality of the factual world? So I said we assume that there's a factual world out there. Some philosophies would say that, well, it's everything you know is in your imagination. Everything you know is in your mind. It may or may not exist as a physical reality. But for our purposes, we will start saying that it is. It does exist. Reality is out there. And somehow we get it into here, we get it into our minds, and a process called knowing. How do we know what we know? We have to start at the beginning when we consider ourselves as human beings. As human beings, we've studied, we've recognized that we have a tool inside of us called our brain. That tool is a very much computer-like device called our brain, called a neural network. It is a bunch of connections of neurons that have connections between them that have chemicals that enable the signal to pass through a neuron and go to another neuron, or a path of neurons, a set of neurons. And those neurons comprise both what we know, that is, a thought is made up of neurons, and what we are able to do. That is, some of our neurons are inputs and some of our neurons are outputs. The primary inputs we have are our eyes and our ears. Then the primary, and our nose and our mouth for taste, and our fingers for our touch, our skin for our touch. But then we have outgoing neurons. Those basically control our mouths when we say words, and our muscles when we move around and when we do things. And the inputs go into our neural network, and somewhere in the processing we learn to make outputs. If you've watched a baby grow, you learn that the baby grows by repetition. He hears sounds and he or she tries to repeat those sounds. As an aside, never speak baby talk to a baby. They think they're repeating what you're saying, so you say it more clearly so that their repetition will get more and more clear. We have neural networks that learn. They learn by repetition. We actually know things by repetition, and we're going through a training stage as we grow where our inputs determine what we know. Those neural networks built within us are limited by what we have seen, what we have heard, what we have tasted, what we've touched. That's all the inputs we have. Well, we conventionally divide ourselves into both the things we were born with, that is the DNA of our parents. We share DNA with our fathers and our mothers, and that is our starting information from which our neural networks are grown. But then we also have our environment, the caregivers, which include mother and father most times, and then the teachers, and then the experiences of other phenomena and other people. We learn by both nurture, who our parents are, and that's nature, not nurture. Nature, who our parents are, and nurture, what we've been taught, what we've been exposed to. So assuming that you might have started as a blank slate, then everything you know comes from your new nature, who your parents are, what your DNA is, and your nurture, what you were exposed to and what you learned to repeat. We also have a third category. For instance, we look at fish who know how to swim upstream to the place that they were born before they spawn. We know that birds fly south for the winter. We know that there is something that is in the brains of animals that is a kind of a memory. And so in our nature there is also some memory passed from parents to children, and that becomes, we will see later, a cultural memory. Your culture determines what your memory of your understanding of certain things, your assumptions you have about certain things, are learned and understood within a cultural background. So here's the thing: you have to assume that there is something out there that you can learn. You have to assume that there is something true to be learned. And with those things assumed, then we can study and investigate how we know what we know about that reality, how we verify what we know. And we will see that there is a relationship between what we believe and what we know. As a matter of fact, a big component of what we know is what we believe to be true. Now, some of the hard factors of all this are we think we're right, and we have very difficult time believing that we're wrong. We don't know why we believe what we believe. We just believe it, and it's held very tightly to us. We don't want to disbelieve it. And yet, intercourse with other people and other forms of intelligence, you will find you sometimes have to take that leap and say, I was wrong. And when you do that, then you can learn. We want to know what we know, how we know it, and how to apply it to our lives. And this field is epistemology, and it's part of how we know who we are as individuals and as a culture.